press the button, Shem. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday night class. If you stand, we'll just open with prayer. Almighty God in heaven, we pause now to consider your greatness. And we think and look around us and we know that you're shaping this world and you're preparing everything for your Son's return. And Father, we're so grateful that you've called us to be part of this plan and purpose. And so thank you for the time this evening where we can come and consider the things that are most important. We can consider your word and how it ought to shape us, the things we can learn from all the record you've given. Help us to grow spiritually. Help us to keep striving to have that mind of Christ in us. So we pray for your guidance upon tonight, and we approach you through your Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, tonight we're continuing our series, but with a new speaker. It was, I thought, going to be Shem's Wanderings in the Wilderness, but he says, no, it's to the title Joshua BC, which is before crossing. So there's no reading, so we'll just ask Shem to come up and give us his class.
Good evening, everyone. Lovely to see you here tonight, and apologies to those streaming in that you don't have the 10 minutes of reading to get ready and get your cup of tea. You're going to have to gird up your dressing gown, and let's get on with it. 1 Chronicles chapter 7, we're going to start at. So just a little bit of context for tonight, that Wilderness Wanderings was kind of the title we were given. But I thought it would be a good time to do something a little bit different, in that we are going to be looking at, we've transitioned from Moses, now we're looking at Joshua. So I thought it would be good to spend these 2 nights just looking at the man Joshua and just getting a really good understanding of his character, what drove him, what motivated him, and what God was trying to teach him, so that as we go through the book of Joshua, we don't have to cover that off, or we can just go through the story. Not sure if that was entirely Lucas's idea, but that's what we're doing. So 1 Chronicles 7, I hope you've all turned there by now. It's a bit of a different place to start for Joshua, but it gives us some background to the tribe that he comes from. I'm sure I haven't read this section in Chronicles before, but verse 20. The sons of Ephraim, Shathaliah and Bered his son, and Tahath his son, and Eldar his son, and Tahath his son, and Zabad his son, and Shathaliah his son, and Ezer and Eled, whom the men of Gath that were born in that land slew, because they came down to take away their cattle. And Ephraim their father mourned many days, and his brethren came to comfort him. And when he went in to his wife, she conceived and bare a son, and called his name Beriah, because it went evil with his house. And his daughter was Shirah, who built Beth Horon, the nether and the upper, and Uzzian Shirah. And Rephah, his son, also Resheph, and Tilah, and Tahan, and Ladan, and Aminihad his son, and Elishama his son, and Non his son, and Joshua his son. So we didn't really go there, well, we did go there to give Joshua a little bit of context to Joshua and his family tree. But we went there for another reason as well, and I think some of the characters in these stories had a real impact on Joshua. We know from the tribe of Levi that the man Levi, really his characteristics seem to define the tribe of Levi. And Judah as well, to a certain extent. And in this section, we're given Ephraim and his sons. And so Ephraim had 4 sons. Shuthiela, Ezer, and Elid. And then those other sons that are given in verse 21 are really the generation of Shuthiela, not Ephraim's son. So it goes the son of Shuthiela, as you go on. So we read that he also had a daughter called Shira, and Shira means superfluous, which, after you've had 3 boys, potentially the daughter is superfluous at the end, but there's nothing like having a daughter with a chip on your shoulder, really, and probably not something that we'll be calling our 4th born. But what happens in this story is that, for whatever reason, somehow, either the men of Gath were invading into Goshen, where Ephraim's sons were, or Ephraim's sons were going up to the children of Israel. The story's not real clear, but either way, the men of Gath kill Ezer and who was it? Ezer and Eled. And so what's Ephraim's response to this? Well, Ephraim, we read in verse 22, he mourns many days. He's clearly very upset about it. And eventually his brethren come to comfort him. And then he comforted by his wife as well. And they have another son called Beriah. And Beriah seems to be the forefather of Joshua. So a lot of genealogies. Why did we really go here? Well, I want to just focus for a moment on his daughter, Superfluous, as she's called here. We're given in verse 24, very, very rarely are our daughters ever mentioned, but in this she's mentioned to have built Beth-horon the nether, the upper, and Uzzian Shira. So the interesting thing about these is they're found in the centre of the land of Israel. So when you think about it, Joseph was second in charge of the king of Egypt, so he's incredibly wealthy, incredibly influential. Here's some sons, one of them's Ephraim, and then he has a daughter lots of daughters, one daughter called Shira that we know of. And she leaves this really comfortable family, this really affluent family, this influential family in Egypt, and goes instead to the land of Israel and sets up 3 cities there at real key strategic places in the land of Israel. They're really in the crossing as you go down to the Shephelah. They're really like citadels in the mountains there. Whether she did that in response to the death of Ezer and Elid, we're not entirely sure, but it is kind of given after that, so it seems the record seems to hint at that. But she shows incredible determination and fortitude to go by herself and set up 3 cities, leaving the land of Egypt and her comfortable home to set up 3 cities in the land of Israel. Obviously, she went with more people to be able to set up 3 cities. It wasn't just her travelling around, but it is something that she did. So I just want to put the question to you. Why is that in the record? And do you think it is... Do you think that's faithful, what she did? Or what's your thoughts about what she did there? Any thoughts about her actions? Just taking it as it comes? Well, I think, in my opinion, I think it was incredibly faithful. I think it's faithful that she went there and that she did it. But was it God's timing? And was it what God was looking for? I'm not so certain about that. And the reason I say that is because when they go into the land of Israel, we don't hear about them anymore, so they clearly didn't prosper. Although it is close to the land of Gibeon, and maybe you could make maybe they had some influence over the land of Gibeon. We're not told that, and that's supposition. The other reason I'd say that they potentially was faithful, but not necessarily what God wanted, is we had a similar instance with Moses, didn't he, where he was trying to stir up the children of Israel to leave Egypt, so he kills the Egyptian. But that wasn't God's timing, and that wasn't what God wanted, and so he ended up fleeing to the wilderness of Midian. And I'm going to suggest that her actions and the way she acted here was faithful and was incredibly courageous, but I'm saying that I don't necessarily think that that's what God necessarily wanted. But I think her courage, her fortitude, her strength, her desire to be in the land, to leave the comfortable home of Egypt, was something which drove Joshua. And that characteristics that she showed in this situation, I believe, are similar family characteristics to what we see in Joshua. And the reason I think she had an impact on Joshua is come to Joshua chapter 19. Joshua chapter 9, this part of Joshua, we're talking about giving all the inheritance to the children of Israel. So we're dividing up the land. And finally, we come to the inheritance of Joshua. And we read in verse 50, Joshua 19, verse 50, or starting verse 49, "And when they made an end of dividing the land for inheritance by their coast, the children of Israel gave an inheritance to Joshua, the son of Nun, among them." So after everyone's got their inheritance, Joshua gets it. According to the word of the Lord, they gave him the city which he asked. So Joshua asked for this city, even Timnath-Serah in Mount Ephraim. So the reason I say that Serah potentially had an impact on Joshua was Timnath means inheritance, and Serah is a very similar Hebrew word to Serah, his great auntie. It's slightly different. I'm not going to be dogmatic about that it's exactly the same. It is slightly different. Instead of superfluous, it means abundance. But I believe that it was potentially changed because now that God has given them the land and it's their inheritance, that it was then termed as abundance rather than a superfluous inheritance. It was now an abundance inheritance. There's no other real reason, naturally speaking, that Joshua would necessarily want that city. It was kind of in the middle of the desert, in kind of the backwaters. There's no, Philistine fortress like that Caleb wanted Hebron for, or anything like that. And I believe he chose what's called the inheritance of Serah because of his great auntie and what she did and how she left Egypt and set up her inheritance in the land of Israel. But I think this characteristic of courage, brashness to some extent, and leadership is definitely something that followed through to Joshua. And potentially also that acting not necessarily, not necessarily with God's timing and how God asked as well, potentially flowed through to Joshua as well. And the reason, I think the proof we have for that's something that Joshua struggled with, is we find in Numbers 13. Numbers 13 is the record of the spies. And we're given all the spies that go out. There's, Caleb from his tribe. And then at the end, Verse 16, these are the names of the men which Moses sent to spy out of the land. And Moses called Hoshea, the son of Nun, Jehoshua. So Hoshea in this means salvation, but Jehoshua means God's salvation. And I think that's what Moses is trying to impress on Joshua at this time. It's not salvation of our own strength, of Joshua's strength, or anything about Joshua. The salvation is only there through God and God's strength. And so he changes his name from salvation to God's salvation. And I believe this is one of the keys to the life of Joshua and what we will see through the life of Joshua and the lessons that Joshua will learn, and we'll expound more on that as we go through. But there's the brashness, the courage, the leadership of Joshua is without question, isn't it? You don't become the leader of an army without some sort of courage and fortitude in you. And he was obviously, as we know, the leader of the army of Israel. He also, sat up in the mountain for 47 days waiting for Moses, and everyone else, had given up and were going around doing the golden calf or were afraid of the quaking of the mountain. But not Joshua. He kind of just stayed there. He showed his incredible loyalty and courage to kind of just stay up there and stay in the mountain. Another example as well is that, as we saw in Numbers 13, he's one of the spies. You don't become a spy if you're terrified. You don't become a spy if if you're weak or not to some extent brash. And he stands, and in that same incident, he stands against an angry mob and says, "No, you've got it wrong. God can save us." That takes incredible courage to stand in front of a mob to do that. And so I believe the characteristics that we saw in Shira's story, we see in Joshua. And I think that the key lesson that I think we're going to see in the story of Joshua, in the characteristic of Joshua that he had to learn, was it's God's salvation, not his salvation. And who better really to mentor Joshua through the wilderness as well, isn't it? Is Moses. That this is a lesson he's been learning for 40 long years in the wilderness of Midian. So who better to mentor him and teach him through this? So let's get stuck into the story of Joshua and the record. The first real mention we have of him is Exodus 17. Just turn over with me to Exodus 17. We're going to cover a bit of ground that we've already covered through the wilderness wanderings, but I'm just going to take it from Joshua's perspective and see what Joshua got out of it and what God and Moses were trying to develop in Joshua's character. So the first mention in the record that we have of Joshua is in verse 9. And Moses said unto Joshua, "Choose us out men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand." And it's interesting, isn't it, that we kind of take it for granted that Joshua was chosen. But I think if we stop and think about it, how long had Moses been with the children of Israel? This is pretty early on. This is within the first month or so of the wilderness wanderings. So Moses really had only been with the children of Israel the period of maybe a little bit before the 10 plagues, then the 10 plagues, then the crossing of the Red Sea, and then a month or so into the wilderness wandering. So Moses hasn't known Joshua for very long, potentially at this stage. I say potentially because we don't really know the age of Joshua. We do know he's older than 20. But is he 60? So Moses might have known him. I suspect that he's not that old at the start of the wilderness wanderings, because when he dies, he's 110, and he's still got another 40 years to live. So I'm suspect he's younger than 40, and we'll come to a little bit about why I think that. But this stands to reason that Moses would have only known Joshua for possibly a month or so, but he's recognised in him something that has made him choose him to be the captain of his army. And when you think about it, who's the obvious choice to be the captain of the army? Like, who's the most trained in warfare? Who's had the most background in, strategy and in the theory of warfare, and has been brought up as a warrior? It's really Moses, isn't it? Like that's his training as the son of Pharaoh, and that's what he would have done for the first 40 years of his life. But Moses decides not to, for whatever reasons, and decides to go with Joshua. For someone he's probably only known for a month or two, maybe a little bit longer, but not too much longer. And he puts him in the captain of the war. It's interesting as well, as a side note, that we never read of Joshua's title as the captain of the army or the great war chief or anything like that. He's always referred to in the record as the minister of Moses. And I think that's probably deliberate by Moses and God to not give titles necessarily to people. And I think that's what Joshua saw himself as well, as the minister of Moses, rather than a great war captain that leads the army, even though that was his role. So we know this story, don't we? That Aaron and Hur and Moses went up to the top of the hill, and whenever Moses held up his hands, Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hands, Amalek prevailed. So Aaron and Hur held up Moses' hands, and they prevailed. And we read in verse 13, Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And then we read in verse 14, and the Lord said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, for I utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek under the heaven. It's quite an unusual kind of end of the war, isn't it? Where God specifically says to Moses, put this in a book and write it as a memorial, something that Joshua is going to think about, something that Joshua is going to remember, something he can look at to remind him of something. And this whole warfare seems to be specifically about that. And we get a bit of an insight into what he's meant to look at, because verse 15, and Moses built an altar and called it Yahweh Nissi, or Yahweh is my banner. For he said, now I'm going to read from, or it doesn't really matter what translation you read, ESV, Net, anything like that for verse 16. But it is, this is the Net Bible. For he said, for a hand was lifted up to the throne of Yahweh, that Yahweh will have war from Amalek to generation. So it's considerably different to the King James there, and I think the King James has got it a little bit wrong there. And the principle behind this is that the reason you're saved is because someone lifted their hands to the throne of Yahweh. Joshua, as great a warrior as you are, as great a captain as you were in this stage, this war had nothing to do with you, and this salvation was not wrought by you. The only reason this victory was won was because, number one, God was their banner. God was something they were fighting under, and also because they lifted their hands to the throne of Yahweh. That is the reason for this, and Joshua, remember this and keep this as a memorial. Rehearse it in your ears. It's God's salvation, it's not your salvation. And in case we miss it, just as a bit of a side note, because some people did miss it, We read in the destruction of Amalek in 1 Samuel 15 and verse 12. And when Samuel rose early to meet Saul, so Saul's just destroyed the Amalekites, and Samuel goes out to meet Saul, and it was told Samuel, saying, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set himself up a place. The same Hebrew word is used there of lifting your hands to the throne of Yahweh, is the same Hebrew words of he set himself up a place. And he's gone about and he's passed on and gone down to Gilgal. So at the destruction of Amalek, Saul kind of set up a monument to himself as kind of a memorial that people can look at and remember how Saul destroyed the children of Amalek. And he's completely missed the point here, hasn't he, of this story of Joshua and what God was trying to teach Joshua. That we are meant to be lifting up our hands not to a monument of ourselves, but to God and to the throne of God. And that is completely what God is trying to teach Joshua in this record of Exodus. So we next read of Joshua in Exodus. Well, really it starts in Exodus 24. Where they've come to Sinai, and there's been an amazing vision in the first part of the chapter, and then God says in verse 13, come up to the mountain and I'll give you a table of stones that you can teach it to the children of Israel. And so Moses and Joshua go up Horeb, they stay there for 7 days, and then Moses goes up to Sinai for 40 days. And, you know, there's the mountains on fire and the children of Israel are distressed. And then we read, we know this story, don't we? Exodus 33 is really the continuation of this story where we have Exodus 32 really is the start of it, where Moses delays, so the children of Israel go to Aaron and Hur, who previously kind of held up Moses and supported him, interestingly enough, and they have the golden calf, and then you have the incident of the golden calf of it, and we read about that, isn't it, where Moses comes down from Sinai to Horeb with Joshua. And Joshua says, "Oh, it's a war. It sounds like there's a sound of battle." Just naturally, as Joshua, the captain of the army, that's what he's thinking. There's a sound. I need to go down there and fix it. But I've, been waiting for you, Moses. But Moses says, "No, it's not that." And I'm just going to go through Exodus 33, 34. I'm just going to summarize a little bit to pick up the key points, because there's no doubt Joshua was heavily involved in these incidents. And even if he isn't heavily involved and wasn't there in person, these are the words that God said to Joshua, I need you to remember and I need you to think about. One other thing I'm going to make a mention about Exodus 33 and 34 is they're really just Exodus 3 expanded. And the reason I say that is because, there's your burning bush, which wasn't consumed in Exodus 3, and then you got your burning mountain in Exodus 33, 34. It's the same place. It's the same mountain. And then God also says to Moses that you're going to come back here and see me again in Exodus 3. And also in Exodus 3, the name of God's given, and we see in Exodus 33 that the name of God is also given or expanded on it at the very least. So just keep that in the back of your mind. There's lots of references back to Exodus 3 and Exodus 33 and 34. So Exodus 32, verses 30 to 32, Moses really goes to God and says, we know what he says. He says, blot me out, but blot me out of your book, but make sure the children of Israel are in your book. And God says to him in verses 33 to 34 that that's not how I work, Moses. I'm a just God, and I punish those who ever do the sins. And so God then sends a plague that we read about in verse 35. There's a plague sent on the children of Israel because of the golden calf. So he punishes the people who did the sins. And then in verse 1 to 3, God says, go on with your journey. Of Exodus 33, verses 1 to 3, God says, go on with your journey, but I'm not going to be in the midst of you. I'll send an angel with thee. And upon hearing that, in verse 4 to 6, the people mourn and they don't put on their ornaments. And God says, verse 5, yep, take off your ornaments. That's a blessing I gave you when you left Egypt, and the Egyptians gave it to you. So, yep, that's right. Take it off and don't put them on again. Leave them at Sinai. Verse 7 to 8 of Exodus 33. Moses knows that God isn't in their midst. So he takes a tabernacle. This isn't the tabernacle we know of, that the four-square encampment around. This is a separate tabernacle that Moses makes, and he takes it outside of the camp. And in this tabernacle, because Moses knows God isn't in the midst of Israel, he takes this outside of Israel and he appeals to God there. And in verse 9 to 11, we read that Moses talks face to face with God in the tent. And verse 11 tells us that, but his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, departed not out of the tabernacle. And Moses, verse 12 to 13, says, well, God, what's happening here? If I've found grace in your sight, if you're speaking face to face with me, tell me your plan, what's going to happen, and just remember that this children of Israel is your people. And verse 14, God replies, I will go with you, Moses, I'll go with you, and I'll bring you into the rest. And nothing's really changed from Exodus 3, has it? Where, in verse 12, God says, I'm with you. And the children of Israel are conspicuous in their absence from that statement. But in verse 15 and 16, Moses says, well, if your presence isn't with us, not just me, isn't with us, then how will we have found your grace? Because that's what defines us, that's what makes us who we are, that makes us the children of Israel. And God says in verse 17, okay, Moses, because you've asked for that, because you want me to go with you as a collective rather than just you, Moses, then I'll do that for you, Moses. But Moses knows the children of Israel won't necessarily believe this. They don't believe things that they can't see and touch and feel. So he says, how will we know that we've found grace with you? Because how will the children of Israel know that? I know it because I'm speaking with you face to face, but how will the children of Israel know? In verses 19 to 23, God really says, sorry, I've skipped verse 17. So God says, right, I will do it for you. So verse 18, Moses says, well, we need a visible sign of it, so show us your glory. Demonstrate to Israel that you're in the midst of them again. You're not just in this tabernacle off outside of the midst of Israel with me. And God says, okay, Moses, I will. I'll proclaim my name before you. Interesting how it is that verse 19, I will proclaim the name of Yahweh before thee, and will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and show mercy to whom I will show mercy. This name that his really is, his name really is that I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and show mercy to whom I will show mercy. And we'll see that in Exodus 34. So his name, we know from Exodus 3, is I will be in whom I will be, or I am in whom I am. But God extends it here and really makes it, and will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and mercy to whom I will show mercy. But because Moses, I won't let them see my face. They don't have the same relationship as me and you have, Moses. Me and you, we can speak face to face as a man speaks to his friend. But as the children of Israel, they can't speak with me face to face because we don't have that same relationship yet. And so go up into the mountain, hide yourself behind a rock, and I'll show you my hinder parts. And that's what the children of Israel can see. Because we don't have that same relationship of being face to face like me and you, Moses, personally are. So verses 1 to 7 of Exodus 34, God shows to Moses his glory. Verse 5, and Yahweh descended in a cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of Yahweh. So what's the name of Yahweh? Well, we know it, don't we? Verse 6 to 7. The Yahweh God, merciful, gracious, long-suffering, abundant in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. The core of God is his mercy, is his compassion. But the other side of it is that he will by no means clear the guilty, and he will visit the iniquity of the fathers upon the children's children, unto the third and the fourth generation. And Moses knows this mercy and grace side of God. He's really seen it all through the wilderness wandering so far. But he also knows that the children of Israel are guilty. He knows that they deserve to have their iniquity visited on them to the third and fourth generation. And so he prays to God in verse 8 and 9. Moses knows they're guilty and don't deserve his grace and mercy. So he begs God to be among them, to dwell with them. And we know he spends most of the next 40 days in Sinai begging for mercy, because Deuteronomy 10 verse 9 tells us that's what he spends it doing. So then the rest of the chapter, God kind of says, verse 10 to 28, that I will continue to do awesome things with the children of Israel to show them that I am with them, that I am amongst them. But they need to follow me, and they need to know that I'm a jealous God. And verse 29 to 35, just as the mountain kind of shone, so Moses' face shone, to show the children of Israel that what Moses is saying in verses 29 to 35 is God's glory, and it is God's reflected glory. So the words he's saying are coming from God. And the children of Israel couldn't even approach to this reflected glory that Moses had here. So why am I going through this? Why am I stressing this? Well, I think this was really clear. Moses was making this really clear to Joshua and to the children of Israel that there's no salvation if God isn't in your midst. And Moses goes to great lengths to show to the people that they need God, and they need God in their midst. And they need God with them, because there is no salvation if it's not God's salvation. The children of Israel chose to not have the same relationship. They said, "No, Moses, you go and speak to God. We can't deal with it. We can't see it." And we read in verse 11, verse 10, and all the people saw the cloudy. Exodus 33, verse 10. And all the people saw the cloudy pillar stand at the tabernacle door, and all the people rose up and worshipped, every man in his tent door. But Yahweh spake unto Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. But Joshua, he didn't depart from that tabernacle, because he saw the importance that Moses had shown to him of being in God's presence and having God as the source of his salvation. And this is really what Moses is drilling into the children of Israel, but also to Joshua at this time, that they require God in their midst. and they require God to be with them. Otherwise, there is no salvation. And this is further expounded in Numbers 13 as well. That's the next section that we have, really, of Joshua and the children of Israel. Numbers 13, we know this story because it's of the spies. And this is the next mention we really have of Joshua after Exodus 33 and 34. So Deuteronomy tells us that the children of Israel wanted the spies to go into the land. So in Numbers 13, verse 1, God acquiesces and says to Moses, send out some spies. And spies are sent out through all, 12 spies are selected and sent out through all the land of Israel. And we're told, verse 22 to 25, that they went to the south and they came to So we're told that, verse 22 to 25, that they went to the wilderness of Zin, which is the southernmost part of their inheritance. Then they go to Rehob, which is near Hamath, which is in Syria, which is the far north of their inheritance. So they've gone the breadth of the land. And then they go to Hebron, and it specifically said that Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. So they go to the strongest fortress that's been there the longest amount of time, that stood for generations, and they go and check that out. And then they go to the valley of Eshcol, which is the fattest part of the land where all the grapefruits is going. So God's telling us in the record that they went everywhere, they saw everything, and they bring back a report to the children of Israel after 40 days, we read in verse 25 of Numbers 13. And what's the report? Verse 27, and they told him, we came unto the land where you sent us, and surely it flows with milk and honey, and this is the fruit thereof. Nevertheless, the people are strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. Moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. So they bring back a full report, don't they? They say, yep, the land's good. We're happy with it, flows with milk and honey. There is strong people in there, there's fortresses in there. Everything a spy would say when they came back. What does Caleb say? And Caleb stilled the people before Moses. So Caleb and Joshua, two of the spies, still the people. And in this context and in this scene, Caleb seems to take the lead. I'm not entirely sure why Joshua is in the limelight a little bit in this scene. I suspect it's probably because Caleb was slightly older, so he kind of took that leadership role. But in this section, it does seem, no doubt, Caleb and Joshua are working together, but Caleb took the lead. Matt, can I just have another drink? Thanks. And potentially it shows that maybe Joshua wasn't the completely natural leader that we assume he is, or maybe he was just deferring to an older. We're not entirely sure why that is the case. But either way, Caleb and Joshua stand up and say, let's go up. We've seen it through the eye of faith. We've seen God amongst us, and we know that we can do it. But we know the other spies bring back an evil report, don't they? And they say, no, it's too bad. The land eats up the inhabitants, and all the men are giants, and there's nothing we can do there. And we had the people's response in Numbers 14, and they cried out and wept, and were terrified. And say, would to God that we died in Egypt. And so they say, well, let's make us a captain, and let's go back. Let's return to Egypt. Verse 4, let's make a captain and return to Egypt. And it's interesting that, there's an obvious captain, isn't there? The captain of their army, it's Joshua, but he's not really seen as a captain, is he? He's more seen as the minister of Moses. They're looking for a natural captain to lead them into war, lead them into battle. But Joshua doesn't, although he acts that role, he doesn't see himself like that. He sees himself as the minister of Moses, not so much the captain of warfare or the great war chief. But potentially that was a trial to Joshua in his life. So then Moses and Aaron fall on their faces, verse 5, fall on their faces before all the assembly. And verse 6, Joshua and Caleb rent their clothes. And Joshua and Caleb say to the children of Israel, verse 7, the land which we went through was exceeding good land. And if, there's a big if there, isn't there? If the Lord delights in us, they don't muddy the waters here. They're kind of saying to the children of Israel that there's no definite here because you're not acting how God would act, how would want us to act. It's also interesting to note that the children of Israel were only going to follow God if He kind of followed their plans, whereas Joshua and Caleb were saying, well, we're prepared to follow God even if He doesn't follow our plans and even if it doesn't go to how we thought it would. So verse 8, if the Lord delight in us, He'll bring us into this land and give it to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Only rebel not ye against Yahweh, neither fear ye the people of the land. And why it's the reason? Because they're bread for us, just like God provided us manna. And their defense or their shadow is departed from us, just like our God is a cloud or a shadow to us. So God is with us, He's not with them, so you don't need to fear. And all the congregation, want to stone them with stones. But what happens? The glory of Yahweh appeared in the tabernacle, verse 10. Verse 11, how long will they provoke me, Moses? And how long will they err to believe in me? For all the signs that I've showed them. I've showed them this manna, this cloud, I've showed them Sinai, and they don't believe, so I'm going to smite them with pestilence. And this follows along the lines of Exodus 33 and 34, where Moses says, well, the Egyptians will hear of it, then they won't think that God's with them. That God wasn't able to bring them into the land, so be with them. Verse 18, the Lord is long-suffering and of great mercy, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation. Remember God, remember your character from Exodus 34. One of the key parts of it is that you're long-suffering, great in mercy, and forgiving iniquity. And so, God, I pardon the iniquity of this people. Part of God's character is that He will visit the iniquity of the fathers upon the children. And Moses says, well, can you pardon them for this one time according to your great mercy, as you've done all the way until Egypt, until now? And what's God's response? Well, God says in verse 20, and the Lord said, I have pardoned them according to my word. So yes, Moses, because you pleaded on behalf of them, because the core part of my character is mercy and truth, I have pardoned them. But then he gives them an implicit threat. Verse 21, but as truly as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of Yahweh. Often we use this as a preaching thing in the record, but this really is a threat by God, isn't it, to say to the children of Israel, I'm going to forgive you for so long, but there's going to be a time when the earth is only going to be filled with my glory. where the earth is only going to be filled with people who are long-suffering, mercy, and who want me in their midst. And this is another key lesson that Joshua would have seen and Joshua would have heard as he was standing with Moses. And the lesson he would have learned as he started to learn as he was spying out the land, that it is God's salvation, and only through God can they inherit this land. There's no way they could overcome these giants or these citadels in the land. It's only through God that they can actually do it. So the next we read really of Joshua is his taking over from Moses. They've had 40 long years of wandering in the land, of which Joshua has kind of dragged these people around because they didn't listen to his words initially. And then he's seen the fall of Moses. I just stop and think about that a little bit as well for the moment. Like, when did Moses strike the rock? It was definitely in the last year of the wilderness wandering, probably in the last couple of months. Joshua would have been going into the last couple of the months thinking, well, Moses is fit and firing, he's looking good, he's looking strong, he's going to take us into the land. But he's had to change that mindset, hasn't he, in the last few months as they come to the land. Because God said to Moses, no, you can't go into the land. And it would have been a sad time for Joshua as he took over from Moses, because he's saying goodbye to a lifelong mentor that he spent 40 long, hard, slogging years in the wilderness. And it was something that he probably didn't necessarily expect to do. And we know from Deuteronomy 31 that he's doomed to fail anyway. He's not going to change the people. They're not going to repent. And just have a look at some of the words that God and Moses use when they hand over to Joshua. Numbers 27, verse 18. And the Lord said to Moses, take Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay thine hand upon him, and set him before Eleazar the priest, and give him charge, and put thine honour upon him. Verse 21, and he shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall ask counsel for him after the judgment of Urim before Yahweh. And at his word, so at Eleazar's word, they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, both he and the children of Israel. There's another implicit reminder as he's taking over, as Joshua's taking over from Moses, that whatever you do, make sure whenever you go in and out, you go in and out to God first. Whatever direction you take, make sure you approach God first. Sorry. Make God the center of everything you do. Yes, and Deuteronomy 31. Thanks. Deuteronomy 31, we also read about Joshua taking over, and the first part of that chapter is verses 1 to 8. The emphasis is God will go with you. In everything you do, God will go with you. He will destroy the nations, and you will possess the land because He goes with you. So we've hammered this point home a lot through the life of Joshua, and we see as he takes over from Moses how he goes with that next week or the following couple of weeks. But the real lesson that we learn from the life of Joshua is that there's only salvation if it's God's salvation, and salvation can only come through God. And the children of Israel, when they looked at the land of Israel, They saw the giants and they thought, no, we can't overcome it. And it was true, they couldn't overcome it. Of their own strength, they could not do it. But Joshua could see through the eye of faith, and he knew that through God, salvation was possible. And so I guess the lesson for us over the next couple of weeks we can think about is that there's no point doing anything if God isn't with you. Only God can overcome the fortresses, the giants that are in our hearts and minds. And the only salvation really that we can have is God's salvation. And Hebrews 4, the writer of Hebrews expands really on the rest. And he talks about that Joshua didn't bring the people into the rest. Otherwise, David wouldn't speak of a further rest to come. And then in the latter part of that Hebrews chapter 4, he talks about that the rest is only achieved during the Sabbath of the kingdom. But the only way you can enter into the Sabbath of that kingdom is if, like the daily burnt sacrifice, we're flayed apart and God inspects us and he finds us perfect, if he finds no sin in us. So how confident are we that we are perfect, that God will find no imperfection in us? Are we there yet? Or do we have giants and cities and walls that we can't overcome? Do we look at others around us and see, the amazing fruit of their works that God wrought through them, and love to see that, but are held back by the giants, by the giants that we have in our mind? Matthew 5, at the end of the Matthew 5 and verse 48, Christ says, "Be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." In my younger years, I was taught that there's maturity. It says, "Be ye mature, even as your Father in heaven is mature." I think that is a fundamentally flawed exposition, and it is probably not looking at the context of Matthew 5 to draw that. Because Matthew 5 is all about the ideals. Christ says to the people, "You've heard it of old, don't kill your brother. I say to you, don't hate. You've heard of old, don't commit adultery. I say to you, don't look upon a woman in lust." You've heard this level, I'm taking it to this level. I'm taking you to the next level, I'm taking you to the ideals. This is what you should be aiming for. When you read Matthew 5, you shouldn't be feeling comfortable. If you read Matthew 5 and feel comfortable, you're reading it the wrong way. There's a reason Christ starts Matthew 5 with, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are those that mourn, blessed are those that are persecuted for my sake. And I believe in Matthew chapter 5, Christ is saying, "Be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." God isn't just mature. So neither, are we called to just maturity. And I think it's deliberately put there to make us uncomfortable. That we know that we aren't perfect, don't we? We know we often fall short of that. But that's what we should be striving for, and that's what we should be looking for. So once again, I'll say the question, how confident are you that you're perfect? Or do we have giants and cities and walls and citadels that we can't overcome, that we've put up in our lives? Well, we all have those, don't we? We all have giants, we all have cities, we all have walls, we all have obstacles which we have in our life which we can't overcome of ourselves. Only through God can we really overcome them. Self-will, fortitude, brashness, courage will never overcome. There will never be salvation through those characteristics. Salvation will only come with God's help. And that's really the lesson of Exodus 33, 34, Numbers 14, that God can save, and the core part of God's character is his mercy, forgiveness, and God will forgive us when we draw nigh to him. Like Joshua went to the tabernacle outside the camp, like Moses went up the mountain and spoke face to face with God. God will have mercy and God will forgive us if we reflect that character or that glory that he's shown to us. Just as Moses reflected the glory of Sinai, the glory of that God showed to him in his face, so we need to show that to the people around us. And only then can we really have God's salvation. And that's really the story of Joshua. Only can we have perfection or salvation with God.
Thanks, Shem. Lots to think about there in Exodus and Numbers. Now, the announcements are as follows. I think we're all aware that meetings will continue as they have been for the last while, being streamed. And if you haven't worked out streaming by now, then I don't know if you ever will. Right, the following duties will... the following things will take place according to God's will. Memorial meeting Sunday to preside in the morning is Andrew Jolly, and to exhort is Brother Jeff Jose. The B in the evening is to the title Character Studies in Resilience, with the chairman being Aaron Johns and the presenter Lucas Cooper. Hall cleaning this week is the responsibility of the following families: Steve Steele, Gordon Franklin, Greg Neal and Matt Wigsell. The next Bible class is our brother Peter Atkins again, back on Micah, his second class for that. And that is it for announcements. So we'll close now in prayer, if you'd stand. Eternal Father in heaven, the God who works salvation with the children of Israel, and who we know is working your salvation with us as well. We thank you, Father. We thank you for your word tonight, the myriad of lessons that we can learn from the life of Joshua and the things that are recorded for us in those chapters. We pray, Father, that you'll help us to strive to have you in our midst, to overcome those castles and obstacles in our life. So, Father, we pray that you'll be with us all to this end, be with us here and those who are not here, be with us all in all of our many varied circumstances. We seek you through your Son, looking for his soon return, how close it must be. Amen.